Hey guys, tonight's story is one that smells faintly of mystery, sandalwood, and something else you might recognise. A plant with more names than a pharaoh's tomb inscriptions. Weed, cannabis, hemp. Call it what you like. It's been rolled, burned, brewed, and blessed since humans first realised smoke could carry thoughts skyward. And yes, the ancient Egyptians were very much in on it. But not in the way modern Instagram historians would have you believe. They weren't exactly hotboxing the pyramids, though that would explain why those corridors are so narrow. No, for them, smoke was sacred. Tonight we'll drift through their temples, their gardens, and their afterlife, following the faint green thread of cannabis through rituals, medicine, and myth. But before you start picturing a pharaoh with a joint, let's slow down. Sink into your pillow like a cat worshipped by the gods. Let your thoughts loosen, like linen unravelling in the breeze off the Nile. The story will take care of the rest. Long before the pyramids reached for the sky, before mummies were meticulously wrapped like linen burritos, humans had discovered something quietly extraordinary. A plant that could soothe, inspire, and occasionally make scribes giggle while measuring temple bricks. Cannabis, in its earliest Egyptian appearances, wasn't a novelty. It was already a trusted companion. Around 1550 BCE, in the bustling heart of Egypt, medical knowledge was inscribed on fragile sheets of papyrus, carefully rolled and stored for generations. Among these scrolls, one stands out for its sheer volume of wisdom, the Ebers Papyrus. A sprawling record of over 850 remedies derived from plants, minerals, and other natural substances. Nestled within its delicate columns of hieroglyphs is a curious entry, the use of cannabis mixed with honey. The instructions are precise. Crush the plant, mix it with honey, and apply it to treat various ailments. Some remedies eased pain, others soothed inflammation, and some targeted the female body, revealing a surprisingly nuanced understanding of gynecological care, probably more than some pharaohs put into styling their own wigs. Other medical texts, like the Ramesseum Papyrus and the Smith Papyrus, confirm these applications. Pain relief, anti-inflammatory treatments, and women's health all relied on this plant in various formulations. It's easy to imagine a healer flipping through these texts, quill in hand, scribbling notes as if the gods themselves had dictated the remedies, while a nearby apprentice whispered, "So this is what we're supposed to do with the green leaves, not the cats, right?" Because naturally someone would try to apply a sticky ointment to a feline at some point. The healer's chamber was a theatre of sensory engagement. Oil lamps flickered against walls carved with hieroglyphs depicting gods, animals, and occasionally a king who looked suspiciously like he was judging the whole enterprise. Shelves were lined with jars of dried herbs, resins, and honey, each labelled carefully, giving off subtle perfumes that hinted at their purpose: earthy, sweet, and medicinal. Archaeologists have found similar jars in tombs and temples, sometimes still holding tiny traces of their original contents, little time capsules from 3,500 years ago. One could almost imagine a faint haze of incense lingering in the background, not merely for aroma but to calm nerves, or perhaps distract from the occasional spilled mixture. Cannabis was not a recreational novelty. It was applied thoughtfully and deliberately. Leaves were crushed into powder, mixed with honey, oil or fat, and spread on inflamed joints, painful limbs, or irritated skin. Oral remedies were less common, but they were documented, taken to soothe internal discomfort. Studies of mummies and residue in ancient containers confirm the presence of THC and other cannabinoids, showing that these instructions were taken seriously and worked. There might have been a little trial and error, of course, especially when sticky honey, finely ground leaves, and a curious cat collided in unexpected ways. Healing was approached holistically. Pain was not only physical, but emotional and spiritual. Remedies often restored balance to the mind as well as the body. A patient might arrive with a stiff back or a throbbing headache, and the healer would consult the papyrus, grind the leaves, mix them with honey, and apply the ointment with calm deliberation, muttering quietly about the apprentice's attempts to help by sneezing into the mixture. Even in the most serious chambers, human folly made its cameo, and sometimes the cat did too. Preparation itself was a ritual. Leaves were crushed into fine powder, releasing earthy aromas that rose like whispers from the bowl. Honey and oils from sesame or castor plants were added for texture, adhesion, and subtle therapeutic synergy. Some recipes included frankincense, myrrh, or other botanicals, forming mixtures that were both practical and symbolic, addressing healing, purification, and spiritual protection. Apprentices sometimes leaned too close, inhaling deeply and immediately reconsidering their career choices while silently contemplating whether to start a catnip side business. Application followed careful protocols. Topical remedies were spread gently over sore areas, sometimes wrapped with linen to enhance absorption. Oral remedies, though rarer, were measured with precision. The papyri even include poetic instructions. Apply with patience, and let the herbs speak to the body as the sun speaks to the Nile. One could almost hear an apprentice whisper, "Is the herb supposed to speak? Because mine is mumbling something about lunch." The conditions treated were diverse: pain, inflammation, gynecological concerns, digestive discomfort, and even spiritual or emotional imbalance. Cannabis bridged observation and practice, body and spirit, science and ritual. Each treatment reflected empirical knowledge, which combinations worked best, under what circumstances, and with what adjunct herbs. Modern chemical analyses validate this, detecting cannabinoids in jars, ointments, and mummy wrappings, confirming that these remedies were more than superstition. Even with all the meticulous preparation, there were moments of gentle absurdity. Spilled ointments, sneezy apprentices, and sticky floors served as reminders that healing was a human endeavour. One can almost hear the healer sighing. Yes, the apprentice spilled it again. Yes, we'll try again. The gods forgive clumsiness, and so shall we. By the time the patient left, whether soothed, comforted, or quietly amused by the healer's muttered commentary about spilled honey, the remedy had served multiple purposes: physical relief, psychological comfort, and a subtle lesson in patience and humility. The jars were neatly shelved, the chamber quiet, and the apprentice hopefully learning to respect both honey and herbs. Cannabis in the hands of ancient Egyptian healers was not merely a plant, it was medicine, ritual, humour, and humanity intertwined. In the warm, flickering light of a temple workshop, the air thick with the scent of dried herbs and resins, the art of making kifi began. Kifi was no ordinary incense. It was a masterful orchestration of nature's most fragrant gifts, a sacred blend designed to bridge the human and divine. References from historical sources, temple inscriptions, papyri, and residue analyses reveal a complex recipe involving multiple components. Frankincense and myrrh form the backbone, their rich, balsamic aroma curling in slow spirals towards the ceiling. Juniper berries added a sharp, almost pine-like note, while cinnamon and saffron may have lent warmth and colour, subtle reminders that the gods enjoyed their sensory indulgences just as much as the people who worshipped them. Some sources suggest that cannabis found its way into this hallowed mix, ground finely and combined with the other ingredients, perhaps a little extra spiritual boost for those performing or observing the ritual. Imagine an apprentice nervously hovering, mortar and pestle in hand, wondering if this inclusion would make the incense too lively. or if the cat in the corner would suddenly declare the workshop its new nap territory. For evidence, modern chemical analyses of Kifi remnants in tombs have confirmed the presence of plant materials including resins and aromatic herbs, and although cannabis residues are rarer, their presence hints that ancient Egyptians experimented with psychoactive components as part of their ritual repertoire. The process of making Kifi was methodical, almost meditative. Herbs and resins were carefully measured, sometimes in precise ratios, and ground together into a fine, fragrant powder. Each ingredient carried not only a scent but a symbolic meaning: healing, purification, protection, or divine favour. Honey, when included, bound the powders together, creating small cakes or pellets that could be burned steadily, releasing smoke that carried prayers and intentions upward. One can picture the apprentice frowning as they mix, muttering under their breath. So, this is incense, not a dessert. While a stray cat surveys the operation with all the judgment of a pharaoh inspecting a pyramid. The textures themselves were a sensory experience. Frankincense and myrrh, brittle and sticky, clung stubbornly to fingers, while powdered herbs floated in the air, tickling the nose and drawing sneezes from the unwary. The workshop became a theatre of aromas, earthy, sweet, resinous, and occasionally pungent, each combination designed to please the gods, calm the mind, and enhance ritual experience. One could almost imagine the gods themselves peering down, inhaling, and nodding approvingly, or maybe rolling their divine eyes at the apprentice who had spilled half a bowl of powdered juniper into the honey. Beyond the sensory delight, Kifi's composition reflected a deep understanding of how materials interacted. Certain resins burned slowly, releasing sustained fragrance. Oils from the herbs carried volatile compounds that lingered, influencing not only the olfactory senses but also mood and perception. Even in preparation, there was an acknowledgement of subtle chemistry. Without the Egyptians needing a periodic table, they already knew which combinations produced the most evocative and enduring smoke. And of course, mistakes happened. A mismeasured cup of honey could render the cakes too sticky. A clumsy stir might mix ingredients unevenly, and the cat might decide that the finest powdered herbs were the perfect new litter. But in these little moments of chaos, there was a rhythm, a learning curve, and a quiet amusement. Kifi's creation was not merely a technical procedure. It was an art that required patience, observation, and intuition. Each batch carried the personal touch of its maker, an invisible signature of the hands that combined the sacred ingredients. One could almost imagine the workshop filled with quiet hums, whispered prayers, and the occasional cough or sneeze punctuated by the faint approving purr of a cat that had decided its judgment was final. The final form of Kifi, small burnable pellets, was elegant in its simplicity. When lit, the smoke spiraled upward, aromatic and enveloping, carrying both fragrance and intention. And while historians and chemists today marvel at the sophistication of these compositions, one can't help but imagine the apprentices of yesteryear sneaking a sniff and wincing. It smells like divine glue, before shaking the powder off their robes and realizing that in sacred craft, as in life, a little absurdity was inevitable. Thus the first stage of Kifi, the careful selection and combination of ingredients, was both a technical achievement and a sensory ritual. From the aromatic resins to the subtle inclusion of cannabis, every component had purpose, intention, and, occasionally, the potential to make the apprentice question their life choices. The mixture was ready, yet the story was far from complete. For once the pellets were shaped and dried, they were meant to be burned, to release their smoke into temple air, and to create an experience that blended the tangible and intangible the medicinal and spiritual, the precise and delightfully chaotic. And so, with the workshop finally settling after the final stirrings of powder, honey, and herbs, we drift naturally toward the next stage, the ceremonial burning of kifi, where the smoke, the scent, and even the faint hints of cannabis intertwined with prayer, ritual, and reverent absurdity, carrying the faithful, and perhaps a few too curious cats, into the realms of the divine. Once the kifi pellets were carefully prepared, dried, and set aside, the next chapter of their story began, the burning. Temple halls, bathed in the soft glow of oil lamps and flickering torches, waited for this transformation. Archaeological evidence, including residue analyses from temple altars and censers, confirms that these fragrant pellets often contained a complex mix of honey, wine, resins, herbs, and, likely, cannabis. Chemical studies of ancient Egyptian incense residues, such as those conducted at Luxor and in museum collections, detected cannabinoids alongside frankincense and myrrh, strongly suggesting that cannabis was deliberately included for its aromatic and possibly psychoactive effects. The air was cool, yet heavy with expectation, a canvas ready to receive the delicate smoke that would carry prayers, invocations, and perhaps the occasional hint of mild herbal euphoria. Classical sources, including Plutarch and later Greco-Roman commentators, describe kefi as a sacred incense used to honour the gods, calm the mind, and purify temple spaces. And while these authors didn't explicitly mention cannabis, the consistency between residue analyses and the textual descriptions makes it plausible that it played a subtle yet intentional role. The act of burning kefi was both practical and symbolic. Pellets were placed in small censers. Archaeological finds in tombs and temples reveal bronze and clay vessels with soot patterns still visible that allowed the smoke to rise steadily. As the embers glowed and the first wisps of scent curled into the temple's rafters, priests and worshippers alike would feel the atmosphere shift. The smell was complex, sweet and resinous, with warm notes of honey and spices underpinned by the deep, slightly pungent hint of cannabis. One can almost imagine an apprentice leaning in too close, inhaling deeply, and instantly questioning their career choices while silently contemplating whether to start a catnip side business. The smoke itself was more than mere fragrance. It was a mediator between worlds. Textual evidence from the Edfu temple inscriptions and the papyrus Bremner Rind describes the use of incense to carry prayers upward, to purify sacred space, and to facilitate altered states of awareness among temple participants. Perhaps a priest kneeling before an altar would inhale deeply and feel a heightened connection to the divine, or simply marvel at how good the temple smelled compared to the streets of Thebes. And yes, we can imagine a stray cat, which had sneaked in with the apprentice earlier, sitting atop a pillar judging the smoke and its human audience with divine indifference. Thinking, amateurs? Evidence from temple inscriptions and graffiti suggests that the use of kai-fi was deeply ritualized. The timing, placement, and even gestures of the priest during burning were all prescribed. Pellets might be burned in sequences, layered with other offerings, or accompanied by chants and prayers. Recipes preserved in later papyri, such as the Greco-Roman period treatises on Egyptian incense, indicate ingredient proportions and layering methods that support a careful and systematic approach. Some recipes hint at cannabis inclusion, though the degree likely varied. One can almost hear the priest whispering, "A touch more of this green herb, and perhaps the gods will be extra pleased, or at least more tolerant of my singing." Kai-fi was also a tool of social and spiritual cohesion. During communal rituals, the fragrance bound participants in shared sensory experience. Worshippers inhaled the layered aromas of resin, honey and spices, and perhaps a subtle tingle from cannabis, while mentally and emotionally aligning with the ritual's purpose. Archaeological studies of temple layouts, including the positions of censers relative to altars, suggest that incense was deliberately designed to flow through sacred spaces, enveloping participants in its scent. One can imagine the apprentice who earlier had spilled powder and sneezed into a bowl, now standing quietly at the temple's edge, taking in the smoke and whispering, "I made that." Sort of. The sensory choreography was meticulous. Priests understood that the way smoke moved, the density of aroma, and the sequence of scents mattered. Too little smoke, and the ritual might feel flat. Too much, and the temple could be filled with choking clouds, leaving everyone, including the cats, coughing and glaring at each other. Inscriptions from Karnak and Abydos depict censers with spiraling smoke motifs, suggesting that the visual rise of smoke was as important as its fragrance, creating a multi-sensory ritual experience. Some texts even suggest that specific timing of incense burning corresponded with celestial events, or the movements of the sun. Kaifi was not just smell, it was cosmic alignment made tangible, a fragrant bridge between earthly and heavenly order. Beyond symbolism, Kaifi's use had practical benefits. Smoke from burning resins has mild antiseptic properties, a fact later corroborated by modern microbiological studies of frankincense and myrrh. While no ancient text explicitly says this smoke keeps germs away, it seems a happy bonus for temple hygiene. And yet, in the middle of a serious ceremony, it would have been unwise to mention such mundane benefits. The focus was on devotion, meditation, and the subtle transformation of mood. And yet, the presence of cannabis hints that these incense ceremonies may have also induced gentle shifts in perception, a moment of altered consciousness that deepened the sense of sacred participation. Humour, of course, lingered even in the most solemn moments. Imagine a priest bowing to the gods, trying to look dignified, only for a small ember to pop and send a flurry of fragrant smoke into his robes. Or a worshipper attempting to maintain a meditative posture while the sweet, resinous scent wafted into unexpected tickles in the throat, or a brief moment of lightheadedness. One can almost hear the scribe muttering, "If the gods don't notice smoke, at least I'll remember to cough decorously." The texts are silent on such minor absurdities, but human and feline reactions occasionally disrupted the perfect solemnity of ritual. The rising smoke, fragrant, symbolic, and occasionally mischievous, carried the story of Kifi beyond mere preparation. It was the alchemy of sensory transformation, raw ingredients converted into ephemeral clouds that could soothe, focus, and elevate. Priests inhaled, worshippers meditated, and the temple became a place suspended between the tangible and the imagined, the earthly and the divine. Every curl of smoke was a messenger, a reminder that even in the midst of sacred ritual, life retained its unpredictable, occasionally comic edge. And so, as the temple hall filled with the soft golden haze of Kifi smoke, the audience, human and feline alike, experienced the culmination of preparation, intent, and a touch of chaotic perfection. From powdered resins to glowing embers, from careful measurement to the inevitable spill or sneeze, every step had contributed to this sacred aromatic moment. The scene was a tapestry, science and ritual intertwined, order and absurdity coexisting, and the faint hint of cannabis threading through it all like a whisper of ancient experimentation. As the final tendrils of Kifi smoke curled upward, weaving through temple pillars and between the faces of meditating worshippers, its purpose extended far beyond mere fragrance. This was the realm where scent, ritual, and human perception intertwined, a space where the Egyptians believed that the divine and the earthly met. Inscriptions from the temples at Edfu and Dendera, along with later Greco-Roman papyri describing Egyptian rites, reveal that incense was far more than an aromatic luxury. Kaifi was intended to elevate consciousness, to purify mind and body, and perhaps, if the subtle cannabis content did its work, to open the door to altered awareness. Evidence for cannabis in Kefi is bolstered by chemical analyses of residue in temple altars and censers. Researchers examining ancient Egyptian incense containers have detected cannabinoids alongside frankincense, myrrh, and other aromatic plants. While the exact proportions remain uncertain, the findings strongly suggest that the plant was included deliberately, not accidentally, hinting at its role in shaping the sensory and possibly psychoactive qualities of the incense. One can almost imagine a priest inhaling deeply and thinking, "Ah, the gods approve," or at least they smell delightful, while a cat snoozed on a nearby pillar, clearly judging the whole enterprise with silent, unimpressed wisdom. The spiritual effects of Kaifi were multifaceted. Temple inscriptions indicate that smoke served as a conduit for prayers, carrying intentions upward to the gods. Texts at Karnak describe incense as mediating between humans and deities, cleansing the air of impurities and preparing the mind for sacred observation. The combination of aromatic compounds, the hypnotic flicker of lamplight, and the careful, repetitive gestures of the priests all worked together to produce a state of serene focus. Modern scholars have compared it to a meditative practice, multisensory cues guiding attention, calming the mind and enhancing the sense of sacred presence. One might imagine an apprentice in the corner, slightly dizzy from the sweet, resinous haze, whispering, "I think I understand," or maybe I'm just very relaxed, and the priest murmuring, "Perfect, that is exactly the effect we desire." Interestingly, Kaifi's effects were not purely symbolic or spiritual. The smoke's aromatic compounds, particularly those from resins and honey, have mild calming and antiseptic properties. While the Egyptians could not measure neurotransmitters or bacterial growth, they were astute observers. Rituals that included Kaifi made participants calmer, focused, and more orderly. A subtle but tangible benefit in communal ceremonies. And, one suspects, the occasional euphoric lift from cannabis may have made prolonged ceremonies more bearable, particularly for the apprentice whose main role seemed to be keeping the cat from knocking over censers. The texts suggest an element of experiential guidance, almost proto-psychology. Priests might instruct participants to breathe slowly, observe the curling smoke, or focus on the interplay of scent and sound during chants. Greco-Roman commentators recorded Egyptian practices in which incense smoke was thought to soothe the soul and carry the mind toward contemplation, and while they may not have appreciated the subtler botanical contributions, their descriptions align with what we now know about multisensory ritual effects. Picture a worshipper in the temple, eyes half closed, inhaling the complex aroma, perhaps momentarily forgetting the stifling heat or the ever-watchful cat, feeling a gentle lightness in both body and mind. The layering of ingredients in Kaifi also reflects a sophisticated understanding of synergistic effects. Honey, wine, and resins interacted to produce both scent and symbolic meaning. Sweetness for divine favour, warmth for vitality, and smoke as a vehicle between worlds. Cannabis, when included, likely added subtle psychoactive notes, enhancing the perception of transcendence. Modern pharmacology confirms that cannabinoids can alter perception, reduce anxiety, and modulate mood, effects that would have complemented the meditative focus of ceremonial rituals. It's easy to imagine a priest whispering, "The gods are pleased," Or perhaps it's just the herbs, while the cat, unamused, contemplates how humans have complicated incense far beyond what is strictly necessary. Humour, of course, did not vanish even in sacred halls. One can imagine the apprentice accidentally knocking over a small censer, sending a puff of fragrant smoke spiralling toward an unsuspecting visitor. The priest, maintaining solemnity, might mutter, "Yes, very dramatic. The gods love flair," while the worshipper coughs and waves hands, marvelling at how incense can both elevate and mildly disrupt. Such small absurdities remind us that rituals were human, not perfect. Even divinely inspired practices had room for the occasional sneeze, startled cat, or sideways glance of bemusement. Spiritually, the rising smoke also reinforced the cosmology of ancient Egypt. Smoke moving upward mirrored the journey of the sun across the sky, the ascent of the soul after death, and the communication of earthly deeds to the divine. Kaifi became a bridge, a sensory, symbolic, and sometimes subtly psychoactive pathway connecting worshippers to gods. Temple inscriptions depict gods inhaling divine incense themselves, while humans mirrored these actions, creating a shared sacred experience. And of course, cats remained the ever-present skeptical audience, quietly judging both preparation and effect. The cumulative impact of Kaifi was thus a combination of ritual, sensory orchestration, and experiential psychology. Participants inhaled, observed, and mentally attuned themselves, experiencing purification, calm, and connection. The occasional giggle, cough, or distracted sneeze did little to diminish the efficacy. It was a gentle reminder that even sacred acts are performed by fallible humans. Archaeology and chemical analyses confirm that the Egyptians' empirical observations were remarkably accurate. Layered fragrances, precise rituals, and deliberate inclusion of plants like cannabis created reproducible effects on mind and mood. By the time the ceremony ended, the temple air was heavy with lingering aroma, tinged with sweet honey, resinous depth, and just a whisper of cannabis. Worshippers, priests, and apprentices alike had experienced a subtle shift: physical relaxation, mental clarity, and spiritual attunement. The scene was a tapestry of order and chaos, devotion and humour, science and spirituality, sensory stimulation and reflection. And, somewhere on a pillar, the cat yawned, silently asserting that no human ritual could ever fully impress a feline. With the temple finally quiet, smoke dissipating, and incense stores neatly replenished, we turn the page to explore how cannabis and Kaifi intersected with medicine, ritual, and daily life in a broader sense, bridging health, devotion, and human experience in ways that are both grounded in evidence and full of gentle, absurd humour. When the last curl of temple incense faded into the dusk, the ancient Egyptians didn't believe the ritual ended there. The fragrance lingered, both in the air and in their worldview. If incense could carry prayers to the heavens, perhaps the same sacred scent could guide a soul to the afterlife. And so, the logic was simple. If the gods enjoyed the smell of Kaifi in life, surely they wouldn't mind it clinging to the dead. By the time of the New Kingdom, embalming had evolved into an art form that bordered on obsessive. The body wasn't merely preserved, it was perfumed into immortality. Modern analyses of mummified remains revealed traces of cedar oil, myrrh, cassia, frankincense, and bitumen, each ingredient chosen with surgical precision and spiritual poetry. These weren't random pantry items, they were a bridge between chemistry and eternity. Now, here's where things get hazy, quite literally. Some researchers have suggested that among these sacred mixtures might have been cannabis. The evidence isn't as clear-cut as the papyrus recipes for pain ointments, but residue analyses from a few mummies, including one from the 21st dynasty, revealed compounds consistent with cannabis sativa. The findings, reported by Savikalpa Sciences and a handful of archaeochemical papers, sparked scholarly eyebrow raises and a fair amount of debate. Of course, consistent with is science's polite way of saying, we can't swear to it, but we'd be foolish to ignore it. The tricky part is that other plants in the Egyptian pharmacopoeia share similar biomarkers. So, whether it was cannabis or something chemically close, the embalmers clearly had a preference for plants that smelled pleasant and slowed decay. If that's not multitasking, nothing is. Picture the embalming workshop, a stone room cooled by the Nile breeze, filled with the scent of oils simmering over small fires. Priests in linen, their faces streaked with black eyeliner, murmuring hymns while measuring out their ingredients with the precision of a modern barista. You can almost hear one sigh and say, a touch more resin, or we'll have complaints from the afterlife again. The process wasn't purely practical. These substances carried deep symbolism. Preservation of the flesh mirrored the preservation of the soul. The head embalmer, known as the Chief of Secrets, operated like a divine chemist. His recipes weren't just for keeping the body intact, they were meant to transform it, to turn mortal flesh into something godlike, untouchable by decay or time. And whether or not cannabis was one of his secret ingredients, it certainly fit the philosophy. A plant that soothed pain, relaxed the spirit, and when burned, filled the air with calming smoke. It feels perfectly at home among their spiritual toolkit. If it wasn't there, it should have been. The ancient Egyptians were too pragmatic to overlook such a multitasker. Still, we must tread carefully. No surviving papyrus explicitly lists cannabis as a key embalming ingredient. Most of what we know comes from chemical residues and educated conjecture, which in archaeology is often as good as it gets. What's undeniable, though, is their obsession with aromatic complexity. Even without cannabis, the embalming room must have smelled like a perfumer's fever dream, a mix of sacred oils, tar, honey, and perhaps a few mystery herbs that kept the priests surprisingly relaxed through the long hours of work. By the time the final bandage was wrapped and the amulets placed, the deceased wasn't just preserved, they were seasoned for eternity. And as the doors of the tomb sealed shut, the air inside held that sweet, spiced aroma, a scent that may still whisper, faintly, thousands of years later, in the dust and linen of the dead. When the embalmers were finished with their fragrant alchemy, the journey of the deceased had only just begun. The body might have been wrapped and perfumed, but in Egypt, death was as much an administrative process as a spiritual one, and naturally one that required ceremony, chanting, and the occasional puff of sacred smoke. Every ritual had a purpose. The opening of the mouth ceremony, for instance, was meant to restore the senses to the mummy, allowing the spirit to breathe, speak, and eat in the afterlife. It sounds poetic until you realise it involved priests gently tapping a chisel-like tool against the mummy's mouth while murmuring incantations. One can almost hear a casual aside. Remember, we want the spirit to chew, not choke. Precision mattered even in the metaphysical realm. The air in these mortuary chambers was thick with incense, resins, and flickering oil lamps. Archaeological studies have found burnt traces of kiphi and other aromatic compounds on altars, censers, and vessels recovered from tombs, including the Temple of Deir el-Bahari, where resins contain terpenoids, chemical cousins of compounds found in cannabis. While this isn't a green light for a literal hotbox of eternity, it does suggest that their spiritual toolkit was designed to be both fragrant and mood-altering. The Egyptians understood atmosphere with almost industrial efficiency. Some scholars propose that the combination of rhythmic chanting, dim torchlight, and pungent narcotic scents was early sensory engineering. The priests may not have understood the molecular structures, but they knew that the human mind could be lulled into calm compliance. Smoke, repetition, and scent produced a collective trance, reassuring both the participants and the grieving relatives. Whether or not cannabis played a starring role, the effect was unmistakable. Serenity punctuated with a faint human relief that everything was proceeding according to divine, or at least semi-divine, plan. Evidence for specific herbs comes from fragments like the Papyrus of Ani housed at the British Museum, which references sweet herbs to please the gods. The text leaves the exact plants tantalizingly vague, perhaps an intentional secrecy maintained by temple priests. Competition was serious. A rival embalmer discovering the perfect mixture could ruin the prestige of an entire necropolis. In other words, even in death, branding mattered. One can picture the chief embalmer smirking. They'll never guess it's just a dash of sticky leaves and a whisper of cedar. The rituals themselves were elaborate. Priests moved in unison through narrow chambers, censer in hand, smoke curling in spirals that softened the edges of the room and the inevitability of mortality. Each movement had rhythm, each chant had cadence, and each aromatic puff carried a dual purpose: to honour the deceased and to modulate the psychological state of the living. The scribe, meanwhile, scratched furiously on papyrus, recording every nuance, perhaps wondering whether the phrase "slightly over-herbed" would translate politely into hieroglyphs. Practicality and superstition intertwined seamlessly. The repeated use of aromatic smoke, oils, and possibly cannabis-like substances may have slowed decomposition slightly, masked odours, and calmed grieving relatives. In a desert environment where sandstorms could obliterate a village overnight, anything that suggested continuity or eternal care, from meticulous bandaging to carefully measured smoke, was reassuring. Archaeological digs from Saqqara and Thebes show that funerary priests' living quarters were filled with jars of unguents, oils, and dried herbs with chemical residues of cannabis-like compounds alongside pine, resin, and myrrh. The evidence doesn't scream certainty, but it hums a persuasive suggestion. The dead were accompanied by more than just prayers. The ceremonies often involved multiple participants. Novices, apprentices, and high-ranking priests worked in synchrony, each aware of their role. One might measure oils, another wave incense, while a third quietly muttered a note about the optimal amount of smoke for enhanced receptivity of the car. Occasionally, a novice would cough, sending a cloud into an unsuspecting corner, an unintended contribution to the ritual's olfactory drama. The chief priest, eyes half closed, would acknowledge it with a calm nod, either communing with the divine or simply accepting that mortals remained entertainingly imperfect. Archaeochemists have also noted that the smouldering of resin mixtures could generate psychoactive effects for the living participants, though the extent remains debated. Terpenes and volatile compounds can create mild relaxation, and in combination with chanting and dim lighting, this may have induced altered states of consciousness, preparing priests to navigate the metaphysical demands of the ceremonies. Whether cannabis itself contributed directly to this effect remains speculative, but the alignment of ritual, aroma, and mood is clear. The Egyptians curated experience with the precision of both artists and scientists. As the ceremony wound down, the final hymn would echo and fade, leaving only the faint crackle of incense and the lingering sweet, almost imperceptible aroma of possibly cannabis-laced smoke. A final offering of bread, beer, or a jar of honey was placed at the tomb's threshold, the last human gestures before eternity claimed its space. Outside, the desert wind dispersed the smoke into the night, carrying the scent across sand and time. And somewhere in that drifting smoke, half faith, half chemistry, entirely human, lay the Egyptian promise of eternity. A bridge between the living and the dead, between ritual and efficacy, between sensory delight and solemn obligation. A scent that hinted at comfort, continuity, and maybe, just maybe, a little secret for those willing to notice. A gentle, fragrant companion for the soul's long journey. When the embalming rituals were complete and the last incense had curled toward the ceiling, a new kind of investigation quietly began, one that would not happen for thousands of years. Modern scientists, clad in lab coats instead of linen, began listening to the chemistry left behind, examining jars, wrappings, and fragments of resin with the patience of a saint and the curiosity of someone who suspects their grandfather's attic might contain a secret recipe for immortality. Using techniques like gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, researchers can detect organic compounds that resemble cannabinoids, the active molecules in cannabis. The results are tantalizing but cautious. Contamination, degradation over millennia, and overlapping chemical signatures with other aromatic plants mean that certainty remains elusive. Some residues match what one might expect from cannabis sativa, yet others could belong to closely related flora or even to resins traded from distant lands. In other words, it's the world's slowest drug test, roughly 3,000 years overdue. The whispers of cannabis in Egypt gain strength when considered alongside neighbouring regions. Sites in the Levant, Nubia and the Sinai show clearer chemical evidence of cannabinoid use, hinting at trade routes, shared rituals, and the subtle exchange of botanical knowledge. Even if the mummies of Egypt yield only partial clues, the broader picture suggests that priests, embalmers, and ritual specialists were operating in a world rich with aromatic plants, some of which may have included cannabis. Laboratories now serve as modern temples, where scientists methodically sample minute fragments of resin, powdered herbs, and traces left on ceramic jars. They measure, record, and analyse, all while imagining the hands that originally handled these materials 3 millennia earlier. One researcher might muse, it's like sniffing eternity, only with better ventilation and a lot more paperwork. Occasionally, the instruments reveal a molecular ghost, a compound that flickers in the data like a half-remembered scent from the past. Even with all this, the story remains partly speculative. No surviving Egyptian text explicitly instructs, add cannabis to the embalming mix. Instead, the evidence comes from chemistry, context, and cautious inference. That said, these small molecular traces, coupled with the ritual use of incense, the Egyptians' documented botanical knowledge, and the prevalence of cannabinoids in nearby regions, create a compelling narrative. The ancients may have chosen their plant allies for both scent and subtle effect, weaving science and ceremony together in ways we're only beginning to understand. And so, the echoes of the past continue to whisper through modern labs. Each jar opened, each fragment analysed, is a conversation across millennia. Scientists listening to silent chemistry, teasing out possibilities, and occasionally smiling at the thought that their work is a very delayed collaboration with the ancient dead. Somewhere between cedar, myrrh, and perhaps a hint of cannabis, the story of human curiosity, ritual, and the search for comfort persists. It's a quiet reminder that history is not static. Every analysis, every retesting with improved detection methods, like the recent studies from the University of Copenhagen and Savikalpa Sciences, adds nuance, sometimes confirming hints long suspected, sometimes rewriting them entirely. And through it all, the molecular ghosts of plants continue to linger, bridging the chasm between life, death, and the unrelenting curiosity of the living. And so, as the embalmers finish their sacred work, the body wrapped, the oils applied, the air heavy with sweet resins and drifting smoke, our story exhales and steps quietly out of the tomb. The hush of stone gives way to open sky. The world of the living hums again. The scent of incense dissolves into the warmer, earthier smell of the fields, soil, water, and something faintly green that hums with life. Because even in Egypt, land of pyramids and prayers, death was only half the story. The other half grew in the sunlight, one careful seed at a time. It is early morning on the floodplain. The Nile stretches like a patient blue vein, carrying the memory of mountains far to the south. Farmers move slowly along the banks, their linen skirts brushing against reeds, their hands carrying baskets of seed. Somewhere, a heron decides to walk instead of fly, the laziest of all Egyptian birds. The farmers ignore it. They have work to do, and the river doesn't wait for daydreamers. Among their crops, there is one plant that seems both humble and extraordinary. Tall, slender, with leaves that fan out like little green hands reaching for the sun. In Egyptian, it was called shemshemet, a word that hums softly when spoken, as if even the language knows it's supposed to sound slightly mystical. Shemshemet wasn't rare or exotic. It was simply there, part of the everyday rhythm of life. But it had a talent for being useful in far too many ways. Rope, sailcloth, medicine, maybe even a little mood improvement when priests got creative with incense recipes. Ancient Egyptian multitasking at its finest. The Ebers Papyrus, written around 1550 BCE, mentions cannabis among its 850 plant-based remedies, usually mixed with honey, oils, or other herbs. But long before the scribes wrote about it, farmers were already coaxing it from the soil. They didn't call it alternative medicine, they called it Tuesday. It thrived in the fertile black earth that the Nile gifted each year after the floods. The farmers knew that if they planted it near irrigation channels, the tall stalks would grow fast and strong, their fibres smooth and stubbornly resilient. It was said that hemp ropes made from these fibres could drag a ship against the current. Some historians might debate that, but personally, I'd like to think a little confidence went into those ropes. In the shimmering heat, the air bends over the fields. You can almost see time itself blur. The farmers move like a single thought across the land, their sandals pressing small hieroglyphs into the mud. Every now and then one pauses to look at the horizon, maybe wondering what the gods think of all this quiet industry. Maybe wondering if the gods ever come down just to smell the fields after rain. And if they did, they might notice something unusual, a sweet grassy scent rising from the rows of hemp. Nothing divine or overpowering, just enough to make one of the lesser gods blink, slowly and say, "Ah, so that's why the priest never seemed stressed." The cultivation of cannabis in Egypt was not a secret ritual, it was simply part of a life. Hemp threads turned into ropes that held the sails of merchant boats. The same boats carried incense, papyrus, and spices across the Red Sea. Some of those goods were used for offerings, others for a good night's sleep after a long day of worshipping. In Egypt, practicality and spirituality shared the same sun, and yet, even this ordinary farming scene had a surreal beauty. The plants swayed in the warm breeze, whispering softly as though gossiping about the pharaoh's latest decree. A water ox watched them without judgment. A farmer hummed under his breath, a tune that might have been about rainfall or goats or possibly lunch. Hard to say. What's remarkable is how seamlessly life and death intertwined in this world. The same soil that grew plants for embalming also grew plants for rope and remedy. The shemshemet may have been used to bind the living world together, both literally, as rope, and symbolically, as medicine and incense for the divine. Later, scholars would analyse this connection through science. Chemical residues found in jars and fabrics hint at cannabis being part of ancient agricultural and medicinal practice. But back then, there were no lab reports, only intuition and tradition. The farmers didn't need to explain why they grew it. It worked. It healed. It bound. And perhaps, occasionally, it helped them laugh when the Nile decided to flood a little too enthusiastically. When the day ended, the fields shimmered under the orange sun. Farmers gathered their tools, their shadows stretching long across the land. The air smelled of earth, water, and green things drying in the heat. Someone joked about how the pharaoh's palace probably had softer rope made from their finest hemp, the kind that never tangled, unlike their hair after a week of work. The others laughed quietly, because laughter was free, even in dynastic Egypt. And as night settled, the whispering plants stilled. The Nile, always listening, carried away the day's murmurs. Perhaps it remembered each one, the gratitude, the exhaustion, the jokes, and the gentle absurdity of existence. Because in Egypt, everything, even a plant, had a purpose. And sometimes that purpose was simply to grow beautifully, smell faintly strange, and hold the world together one fibre at a time. When the morning mist lifted from the fields, and the last frogs finished their philosophical croaking about nothing in particular, the hemp stalks that had soaked up the Nile's blessing were ready to begin their second life. Because in Egypt, nothing truly ended. It just got recycled into something even more practical, this belief system that worked wonderfully for both souls and fibres. The Shemshemet that once swayed lazily in the breeze now found itself on a very different kind of journey, through a process that probably smelled worse than the historians admit. The stalks were soaked, pounded, and pulled apart, until they became long, silky threads of hemp fibre. Some of these threads would end up in the hands of rope makers, their fingers stained with oil and sun, twisting and braiding with a kind of focus usually reserved for high priests and cats about to pounce. The workshops near the Nile were symphonies of rhythm, ropes creaking, looms thudding, merchants yelling helpful encouragement from a safe distance. From these places came the ropes that moored ships, the sails that kissed the wind, and the nets that brought in the fish that fueled half the kingdom. Each strand of hemp was a small act of devotion, to work, to water, to whatever god oversaw productivity and minimal rope burn. Evidence for this industrious use of hemp comes from rope and textile fragments found at archaeological sites like Deir el-Medina and Giza, their fibres remarkably preserved by Egypt's dry climate. Under the microscope, researchers found what ancient hands already knew. Hemp was tough, reliable, and beautifully uncomplicated. It didn't pray to be noticed. It just held things together. Quite literally. It's oddly comforting, isn't it? To imagine that while priests were debating the nature of the soul, and astronomers charting the heavens, some anonymous artisan was just trying to make a rope that wouldn't snap halfway across the Nile. History remembers the pharaohs, but it was the rope makers who kept the monument supplied with lunch. Sailcloth woven from hemp carried Egyptian ships beyond their familiar shores, across the Red Sea, down to Punt, where incense and gold awaited. The sails, wide and pale under the desert sun, billowed like great lungs exhaling into the horizon. Each creak of hemp cord was a reminder of how plants from the Nile soil connected Egypt to the wider world. Without them, trade would stall, temples would darken, and someone would probably have to explain to the pharaoh why his favourite perfume shipment was late. There is a strange poetry in this, a civilization so vast and golden, yet quietly dependent on a humble green plant. The rope, the sail, the fabric, all of it started as a seed in the mud. And somewhere in that cycle, there's something beautifully Egyptian, that belief in transformation, in usefulness beyond the obvious. You could say the Egyptians were early masters of upcycling, long before anyone made tote bags out of old jeans. In the markets of Thebes and Memphis, hemp goods were traded with the same seriousness as spices and grain. A merchant might boast about the strength of his fibres, claiming they were woven from plants blessed by Hathor herself. Though Hathor, goddess of joy and dance, may have had other hobbies, still it made for good marketing, and one suspects ancient commerce was already familiar with the concept of influencer endorsement. The smell of those market streets must have been something. Baked bread, burning resin, camel and fresh rope. Every scent had a purpose. Every sound had rhythm. Children played beside baskets of hemp twine. Priests haggled over sailcloth, and farmers watched their harvest turn into something that might one day carry offerings to faraway temples. The fibres of cannabis wove their way into nearly every layer of Egyptian life, from the ships that carried the gods' incense, to the ropes that raised obelisks, to the nets that caught dinner. And somewhere between the pyramids and the papyrus scrolls, hemp quietly became one of the kingdom's unsung heroes. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The sound of ropes tightening, sails snapping open, and traders calling across the river. The wind catches in the hemp and hums a low note, like the Nile itself joining in the song. And for a moment, everything is connected. Earth, water, plant, and human, bound together by green threads spun from sunlight and patience. Perhaps that's the secret of Egypt's endurance. Not just the monuments, or the gods, or the golden tombs, but the quiet, practical genius of turning plants into permanence. A civilization that grew ropes sturdy enough to tug eternity a little closer. And as the sun sinks once more behind the western dunes, the ropes slacken, the sails fold, and the fields fall silent again, waiting for the next season, the next flood, the next absurdly ambitious pyramid order. But for now, the hemp rests, dreaming in the cool dark, perhaps whispering to itself that it once held up the world, and no one even noticed. Night settles gently over the Nile. The day's work has ended, and Egypt exhales. Somewhere, a small oil lamp flickers in a mud brick home. The air smells of grain, smoke and warm air drifting through woven mats. And hanging from one corner, almost forgotten but not quite, is a coil of hemp rope, frayed at the ends, dusted with the day's stories. Because in ancient Egypt, cannabis wasn't rare or mystical. Not really. It was present, woven into the ordinary, hiding in plain sight between ritual and routine, between prayer and practicality. The kind of thing everyone used but no one wrote sonnets about, which when you think about it, might be the truest sign of cultural importance. Hemp was the quiet assistant of Egyptian civilization. Its fibres pulled ships through water, held jars closed, and fastened the sails that carried merchants towards sunrise. But beyond its fibres, the plant itself had other roles, small, everyday ones that don't make it into museum plaques. Mixed into poultices, chewed for ailments, offered in incense, cannabis found its way into domestic medicine and ritual alike. The Ebers Papyrus, that ancient patient list of treatments, doesn't exaggerate or mystify it. It simply notes cannabis as another remedy, mixed with honey, used to soothe and heal. A quiet note in the world's first pharmacy catalogue. No celebrity endorsements, no exaggerated claims, just another plant doing its job for a few thousand years. You can imagine it. An elderly woman grinding seeds with a stone pestle, muttering softly about her aching joints. She sprinkles the mixture into warm oil, dips a linen cloth, and ties it around her wrist. No miracle promised, no divine light, just a small, practical kindness passed down through generations. That's the thing about Egyptian medicine. It wasn't only about grand temples and godly offerings, it was about comfort and the plants that offered it. And yet, Because Egypt never did anything without a touch of the divine, even these humble remedies carried symbolic weight. Cannabis was sometimes associated with the goddess Shat, the divine librarian of wisdom, writing and architecture. A fitting link, really, a plant of structure and connection, aligned with a deity who measured time and recorded eternity. Perhaps that's why priests considered its smoke a bridge between worlds. Not dramatic, not hallucinatory, just gently thinning the veil between thought and prayer. In a temple courtyard, incense curls lazily upward, joining the scent of lotus and myrrh. Somewhere a scribe leans on his stylus and wonders whether the gods ever get tired of smoke signals. The hieroglyphs he carves will outlast him, of course. But for now, he just watches the smoke drift and thinks about dinner. Cannabis didn't belong only to the temples or the farmers. It slipped through every layer of Egyptian life. The household, the workshop, the shrine. It lived in the ropes that moored boats, the oils that soothed pain, the incense that softened prayers. Its versatility was its camouflage. It became so useful that it stopped being noticed. That's how it earned its place in the rhythm of daily life, by blending in perfectly. And through that ordinariness, something quietly profound happened. While gold and granite built Egypt's legacy, hemp helped sustain it, invisibly, constantly, uncomplainingly, like a background hum that held the melody together. It's easy to imagine an evening scene, a fisherman mending his hemp net by lamplight, his daughter humming beside him, a mother boiling herbs for medicine, the faint scent of cannabis rising with the steam, a priest walking home through the temple courtyard, catching a whiff of kifi incense laced with something familiar, something earthly, all unaware that centuries later strangers would pore over their fragments, astonished at the sophistication of their everyday lives. Modern studies have confirmed what the ancients seemed to know intuitively. Traces of cannabis have been detected in mummified remains, in jars, fabrics, and incense burners. The evidence hums like an echo through time, saying, yes, it was here. Yes, they knew it. Not as myth or indulgence, but as part of the great ecosystem of their civilization. So perhaps that's the truest magic of it, not in getting high, but in lifting life itself just a little higher. A civilization of engineers and dreamers, grounded in the soil and reaching toward eternity, quietly trusted a green plant to help hold everything together. And maybe, if you listen closely, between the shuffle of papyrus, the rustle of reeds, the hum of distant frogs, you can still hear it. The whisper of hemp threads brushing against linen, the faintest laughter of farmers, the quiet sigh of the Nile at dusk. A soft reminder that in the grand machinery of Egypt, even the smallest fibres mattered. Because greatness, it turns out, is built not just from stone and gold, but from green things that grow quietly by the river, doing their work in peace. And as the night deepens and the stars lean low over the desert, Egypt sleeps. The fields glisten under the moonlight, the ropes rest coiled beside empty boats, and the Shemshemeh sways gently in the dark, dreaming perhaps of all the ways it once held a civilization together. When the last torchlight fades from the tomb, and the mummy rests beneath layers of linen and resin, it's easy to think that Egypt's secrets have gone to sleep, but history has a funny habit of waking up in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes it whispers beneath the microscope. Imagine a modern laboratory, a sterile room humming with fluorescent light, the faint smell of ethanol hanging in the air, machines whirring softly like mechanical scarabs, and a scientist peering carefully into the lens of her microscope. Somewhere between the hum of the centrifuge and the steady tick of a clock, there is a quiet, almost mischievous voice, the echo of an ancient Egyptian healer saying, "Finally you found me." And there it is, a fleck of dark resin, perhaps no larger than a grain of sand, clinging stubbornly to a fragment of linen once wrapped around a noble or a priest. It is cannabis, preserved against the march of time, surviving fires, floods, and the curiosity of archaeologists. Modern science, in its precise and sometimes pedantic way, has finally caught up to the Egyptians. Chemical analysis, specifically gas chromatography mass spectrometry, GCMS, allows scientists to separate complex mixtures of organic compounds into distinct fingerprints. When applied to ancient Egyptian artifacts, this technique has revealed the unmistakable presence of cannabinoids, THC, CBD, and other plant compounds. Evidence comes not only from the mummy wrappings themselves, but also from jars, ointments, and incense burners excavated from tombs in Thebes, Saqqara, and other sites. Researchers at institutions like Savikalpa Sciences and projects cataloguing chemical residues have confirmed it. Cannabis was here. It was real. It was deliberate. The Ebers Papyrus, composed around 1550 BCE, provides textual confirmation of this botanical relationship. It lists dozens of plant-based remedies, some applied topically, some ingested, all designed to relieve pain, inflammation, or other ailments. Cannabis appears among these recipes, often combined with honey or oils, substances that preserved its active compounds while softening its bitter bite. The synergy of ancient herbal knowledge and modern chemistry is astonishing. What was once a scribbled note on a papyrus scroll is now a spectrum of peaks on a chromatograph, translating millennia of practice into molecular proof. Some of these residues are subtle, a faint trace of THC clinging to a funerary jar, a smidge of CBD hidden in embalming oils, just enough to suggest that the plant served multiple purposes: medicinal, ritualistic, and perhaps spiritual. The ancients, for all their meticulous mummification techniques, also had a practical understanding of chemistry. They may not have measured milligrams or run controls, but they observed outcomes: pain soothed, spirits lifted, rituals enhanced. There's a strange poetry in this. Consider a small jar excavated from a burial chamber. Brown clay, slightly chipped at the rim, buried beneath centuries of dust and sediment. Chemical analysis reveals cannabinoids. For the modern observer, it is a thrilling discovery. For the ancient soul who placed it there, it was simply part of the toolkit of life and death. Medicine and magic combined in a single vessel, waiting patiently for the future to notice. And then there is the mummy itself. Residue analysis of linen wrappings has shown traces of cannabis compounds in multiple samples, suggesting that cannabis was incorporated into embalming oils or ointments. Scholars speculate that these substances were intended to preserve the body, but perhaps also to ease the transition to the afterlife. Some might say it was symbolic, others practical. Either way, the plant was woven into the very process of crossing from life to eternity. And now, thousands of years later, we can detect its presence with instruments the Egyptians could not have imagined. Imagine the absurdity of it. A lab technician, carefully pipetting samples into tiny vials, might pause, sniffing the air, ethanol, not ancient resin, and think of the priest who once ground these leaves with the same meticulous care. Somewhere across time they are laughing together, one amused at the tiny machines, the other at the modern obsession with proof. The cannabis doesn't care about credit or patents or journals. It just keeps existing, quietly bridging millennia. Chemical residues aren't just curiosities. They provide a direct link between the textual record and material culture. They confirm what historians have long hypothesized. Cannabis played a real role in ancient Egyptian daily life, medicine, and ritual. In a sense, each peak on the chromatograph is a voice telling us, we were here, we mattered. And yes, you could have used us responsibly, preferably with a cup of warm Nile water. The technology that reveals these whispers is precise, almost absurdly so. Gas chromatography separates compounds into peaks, like little mountains on a paper trail, each one distinct, each one stubbornly stubborn, each one a message from the past. And when the data is interpreted, it paints a picture of a civilization that understood the subtle power of plants, not in the abstract, but in practice. The same society that built pyramids and mapped the stars also knew that a plant could soothe pain, enhance ritual, and preserve the dead. And so, as the centrifuge spins, purring softly, as sensors beep and the microscope lens magnifies the infinitesimal, one realizes that science is, in some ways, just a modern ritual. White coats replace linen robes, fluorescent lights replace torches, computers replace papyrus. But the fundamental act, observing, recording, revering what is present, is the same. Perhaps that's the most beautiful part of it. The Egyptians, in all their ancient wisdom, are still conversing with us, not through voices, but through molecules. Tiny flecks of cannabis are their letters, their proof, their laughter encoded in resin and fibre. And as the lab hums with electricity, one can almost hear them whisper, dryly amused, "So you finally noticed. Even in evidence there is whimsy. Even in proof there is poetry." And as the scientist carefully labels the next vial, adjusts the spectrometer and jots down notes, she might pause and think, as you might in the quiet hours before sleep, that sometimes history isn't something you read about. It's something that leans over your shoulder, hums softly, and reminds you that the past, like the plants it treasured, is always more alive than you imagined. And in that quiet laboratory, with the hum of machines echoing faintly like the Nile at dawn, the whisper beneath the microscope continues, patient, eternal, and ever so slightly amused. After the microscope hums its quiet song, and the lab has traced the first fingerprints of cannabis, the story drifts back down the Nile, not to the fields, not to the workshops, but to the tombs, the incense burners, the jars that held the secrets of the afterlife. Archaeologists digging in Thebes and Saqqara have found small vessels, carefully sealed with clay stoppers, their contents a mystery until modern chemical analysis gave them voice. And what they whispered was remarkable. Traces of cannabinoids, terpenes, and aromatic compounds, molecules perfectly preserved through millennia. It is not merely curiosity that excites the modern observer. This is evidence that cannabis was intentionally incorporated into burial practices. These jars may have held oils or pastes, sometimes mixed with frankincense, myrrh, or other fragrant substances. And in that combination, there was purpose. The preservation of the body, the comfort of the spirit, and perhaps the gentle encouragement of a calm journey into the afterlife. The techniques used to detect these traces are both precise and magical in their own right. Gas chromatography mass spectrometry allows scientists to separate and identify individual chemical compounds in ancient residues. Peaks on a graph correspond to cannabinoids, each peak a whisper from the past saying, "We were here, we mattered, and yes, we were carefully measured, not accidentally sprinkled in." Consider a small jar recovered from a tomb near Luxor. Brown clay, crusted with age, faintly cracked along the lid. Analysis shows THC and CBD residues in quantities consistent with ritual or medicinal use. It's humbling to think that an artisan or priest carefully mixed these compounds thousands of years ago, unwittingly leaving a puzzle for modern minds to solve. Beyond jars, incense burners reveal more intimate traces of cannabis use. Kaifi, the famed Egyptian incense, was a complex mixture of resins, honey, wine, and sometimes cannabis. Burned at sunset or during ceremonial rites, it created an atmosphere of calm, reverence, and subtle euphoria. Residue analysis confirms that cannabinoids survived the centuries, clinging to the blackened interiors of these burners, as if determined that even now they would tell their story. Some studies suggest that different burial goods contain different combinations of plant compounds, tailored for particular social classes or ritual purposes. A noble's tomb might have richer, more aromatic blends, while simpler burials carried modest traces. Even these small differences hint at a sophisticated understanding of the plant's properties, practical, ceremonial, and possibly spiritual. And yet, it is hard not to smile at the surreal picture these chemical residues paint. Imagine a priest, centuries ago, adding the final pinch of Shemshamet to an aromatic mix, perhaps muttering, "May this help the soul float, or at least keep the embalming oils from smelling too sad." Or a scribe carefully noting the proportions, slightly distracted by a cat perched on his shoulder. The molecules left behind carry the faint echo of these moments, tiny fingerprints of whimsy embedded in sacred practice. The presence of cannabinoids in these artifacts is more than a footnote. It confirms long-held hypotheses drawn from medical texts and ritual descriptions. Scholars have long suspected that cannabis had multiple roles, as medicine, as part of mummification, and as a ritual enhancer. Modern chemical analysis cements this claim, connecting textual, artistic, and material evidence into a cohesive narrative. Even seemingly mundane burial items reveal subtle complexity. Linen wrappings, powdered resins, and ointments. Each one retains microscopic traces of cannabis, detectable only with sophisticated tools. These traces are not accidental. They reflect intentional inclusion, careful preparation, and an awareness of the plant's effects. The Egyptians were early chemists, alchemists of the afterlife, using green threads of nature to weave both practicality and spirituality into their work. There is also a narrative irony here. The plant, which might have been laughed at by modern purists for its simplicity, was in fact an essential part of rituals designed to transcend mortality. A humble herb, quietly effective, persisted through centuries of tomb robbers, floods, and the slow erosion of sand, only to be rediscovered by a world obsessed with molecular signatures and proof. Imagine standing in a dimly lit museum storage room, jars lined like soldiers, each one containing centuries of patient decay and preserved purpose. Pick one up, and you are holding a story that began in a small workshop or temple, a story of careful hands, ceremonial intent, and a plant that knew how to endure. And in the quiet of that room, one might feel a connection across time. The ancient Egyptians, who prepared their dead with such meticulous care, and modern scientists peering at graphs and spectra, are engaged in a dialogue spanning millennia. Not words, not prayers, but molecules. Whispers of green, faint and persistent, telling a story that refuses to be forgotten. Through these traces we see the duality of cannabis in ancient Egypt, practical and sacred, ordinary and extraordinary, alive in life and death alike. It was medicine, incense, preservation and ritual, a bridge between the corporeal and the divine. And now, thanks to the careful work of modern science, we can hear that bridge hum softly, connecting the living, the dead, and the curious observer. Perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of the traces. Even the smallest elements and a fleck of resin, a hint of cannabinoid, can carry history forward, like a green thread weaving through the tapestry of civilization. They remind us that life and ritual, science and poetry, past and present, are never entirely separate. They hum together, quietly, persistently, eternally. And so, as the lab lights flicker and the microscope clicks to a halt, one cannot help but feel that ancient Egypt is still speaking, softly, whimsically, and with a wry sense of humour, through the tiniest of molecules, waiting for those who will listen. After microscopes have whispered, jars have sung, and chromatographs have traced their peaks, there remains a quieter, more intimate form of discovery, listening to what the dead have to tell us. Because in Egypt, death was not an ending. It was a conversation, conducted in silence, ritual, and sometimes the faint lingering scent of cannabis. The very presence of cannabinoids in mummies, embalming oils and funerary objects is like a note pressed between the pages of time, a message encoded in molecules waiting for modern ears to hear. Modern scientific techniques confirm what historians had long suspected. Residue analysis reveals cannabinoids preserved in linen wrappings, jars and incense burners, suggesting that cannabis was purposefully incorporated into mummification and burial practices. The chemical signatures of THC and CBD, detectable thousands of years later, are tangible evidence that Egyptians were deliberate in their choices, a plant selected for its practical, medicinal and possibly spiritual properties. It is tempting to imagine the first time this data was analysed. A laboratory, quiet except for the hum of machines, a scientist leaning over a sample, and the faint, almost imperceptible thought, "I can hear them." Not literally, of course, though perhaps a little literally in a whimsical sense. The mummies, the jars, the aromatic oils, they all seem to vibrate with the echo of careful hands, meticulous preparation, and centuries of ritual. Cannabis, then, was more than a tool. It was a participant in a dialogue between life and death. When the priests and embalmers prepared a body, they were crafting not only a vessel for eternity, but also a sensory environment for the spirit's journey. The plant's calming, medicinal or psychoactive effects may have been intended to soothe the deceased, to ease transition, or to honour the divine. And now, millennia later, we are the recipients of that conversation, translating their intentions through modern chemical and forensic analysis. Take, for example, the careful inclusion of cannabis in Kifi incense, burned in temples during rituals or alongside the mummification process. Kifi was a carefully composed blend of resins, oils, and sometimes cannabis. Its smoke would have been an invisible participant, curling around the body and temple alike, creating an atmosphere that bridged the earthly and the divine. Chemical analysis of residue from ancient burners confirms that cannabis compounds persisted in these materials, a testament to the thoughtful rituals of Egyptian priests, and there is subtle humour in this dialogue across time. A modern scientist pipetting a tiny sample into a GCMS vial might imagine a priest peering over their shoulder. Yes, that's exactly how we intended it, though your fluorescent lighting is excessive. Or perhaps the mummy itself, bound in meticulous linen, might whisper, "Finally, someone noticed my ointments were well chosen." History, after all, is never entirely serious. The data also invites us to reconsider the Egyptians' relationship with plants. The presence of cannabinoids in funerary and medicinal contexts suggests they understood, even if intuitively, the multifaceted properties of cannabis. It was a bridge between body and spirit, medicine and ritual, the tangible and the invisible. A humble herb became a participant in one of humanity's oldest dialogues, life speaking to death and death whispering back. Importantly, these findings also demonstrate the continuity of cultural knowledge. Textual sources like the Ebers, papyrus, and archaeological artifacts converge with chemical analysis to show that cannabis was not accidental, not occasional, but integrated into daily, medicinal and ritual life. The conversations we hear today, through molecules, spectra and residues, are echoes of practices deliberately designed to honour and preserve life in all its dimensions. Perhaps the most profound element of this conversation is its persistence. The molecules, surviving thousands of years, act as emissaries from the past. They allow a quiet, almost surreal dialogue. A scientist in a fluorescent-lit lab interprets the patterns. The mummy rests in silent patience. And somehow, across time and culture, the two meet. One seeks knowledge, the other imparts experience. And in this meeting of epochs, one is reminded of the Egyptian worldview. Life and death are entwined, practical and spiritual are inseparable, and even humble plants like cannabis can carry profound significance. The whispers beneath the microscope, the traces in jars and incense burners, and the dialogues with the dead all point to a civilization that approached mortality with both pragmatism and reverence, humour and solemnity, science and poetry. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine a mummy wrapped carefully in linen, scented faintly with cannabis and resins whispering through time. Imagine a priest mixing oils and powders with meticulous hands, offering comfort and ritual. Imagine a modern scientist listening carefully, translating molecular messages into graphs, spectra and words. And in that space, across millennia, the conversation continues, soft, subtle, and surprisingly witty, like history itself telling you a secret just before you drift into sleep. The dead have stories to tell. Sometimes they tell them through tombs, through texts, through art. But sometimes they whisper through the molecules they left behind. And if you listen closely, with curiosity and patience, even the faintest residue can speak volumes. When you think of ancient Egyptian art, you might picture towering statues, intricate pyramids, or pharaohs gazing eternally toward the sun. But look closer, lean in, squint just slightly at the carved lines and painted scrolls, and you might notice something quieter, something green, the subtle presence of plants woven into the fabric of eternity. Among them, a humble, yet remarkable thread, cannabis. Hieroglyphs are in many ways the ancient Egyptians' text messages to eternity. Each symbol, each carefully etched plant or curling reed, carries meaning, purpose, and occasionally whimsy. Cannabis, sometimes represented as a delicate leafy plant in reliefs, or papyri, was rarely the star of the show. Yet it appears, not as a mere decoration, but as a marker of life, ritual, and divine connection. Consider Seshat, the goddess of wisdom, writing, and measurement. She is often depicted holding her notched palm or stylus, recording the deeds of kings and priests. In some artistic interpretations, she's associated with plants that may include cannabis, small, almost imperceptible nods to a plant that accompanied humans in both medicine and ritual. Scholars suggest that these depictions are not accidental. Cannabis was intertwined with knowledge, with healing, and with the recording of human activity. Perhaps it helped inspire precision, calm the hand, or subtly whisper, "Yes, the papyrus will survive for millennia, trust me." Bastet, the feline goddess of home, protection, and domestic life, may also have had cannabis in her orbit, or at least in the symbolic sense of the plants shown near her altars and shrines. The Egyptians had a fondness for layering meaning. A single plant could represent health, spiritual clarity, and divine approval all at once. One imagines a cat deity lounging beside a carefully drawn cannabis plant, tail flicking, judgmental gaze fixed on the artisan. Yes, it will heal, it will calm, and yes, it looks quite symmetrical for once. Archaeological evidence supports these artistic nods. Certain depictions in temple reliefs and painted papyri appear consistent with cannabis sativa morphology. The jagged leaves, narrow serrations and bushy appearance. While exact identification is challenging, scholars cross-reference artistic representation with textual sources, like the Ebers Papyrus or Ramesseum Papyrus, to corroborate that cannabis was indeed recognised and valued. In other words, these plants weren't imaginary doodles. They were carefully observed, culturally significant species embedded into the language of art. The beauty of Egyptian art is in its duality. On one level, it is precise, almost mathematical, recording history and ritual with meticulous care. On another, it is playful, surreal, and sometimes absurdly human. Imagine an artisan, quill in hand, tasked with drawing a line of plants along a temple wall. He pauses. He frowns. One leaf looks like a lotus, another like a palm, and then, perhaps inspired by incense fumes or just plain whimsy, he draws a jagged little leaf that seems to be grinning. Millennia later, we look at it and think, "Ah, yes, that is surely cannabis, and possibly it is laughing at us." Cannabis in art was rarely isolated. It existed alongside lotus flowers, papyrus reeds, and other sacred plants, contributing to a layered symbolic ecosystem. In some depictions, it may have been included in healing rituals or medical scenes, bridging the worlds of the mundane and divine. A priest may be shown holding an ointment jar, a scribe writing, a goddess observing, and nestled subtly in the background, a cannabis plant, quiet but essential, lending calm, clarity or potency to the scene. One particularly charming example is a painted papyrus showing a healer preparing a poultice. The herbs on the table include lotus, coriander, and a leafy plant scholars suggest is cannabis. The practitioner, focused and serious, barely glances at it, but we, peering through the centuries, notice it, smile, and imagine him thinking, "If only the gods knew I added this one extra leaf. It makes the pain disappear faster." And yes, the cat seems to like it too. Hieroglyphic depictions often encoded more than just utility. They conveyed cultural significance and reverence. A single cannabis leaf carved into stone or painted on papyrus might signal not only healing or ritual use, but also a connection to the divine, an acknowledgement that life itself was threaded with small, potent living elements. It was ordinary and extraordinary all at once, a green whisper woven into eternity. And here, this surreal begins to mingle naturally with the evidence. Imagine wandering through a temple at twilight. The stone walls shimmer faintly in the torchlight. The reliefs of gods and mortals appear to move slightly, as if the shadows themselves are breathing. Among the lotus flowers and papyrus stalks, the cannabis leaves sway. Not because of wind, there is none, but because the art remembers, because the plant, in its quiet, persistent way, still participates in the ritual of the world, long after the hands that carved it have turned to dust. Thus, in the tapestry of Egyptian art, cannabis plays a subtle, enduring role. It is medicine, magic, ritual, and symbol, carefully tucked into hieroglyphs, temple walls, and papyrus scrolls. Its presence reminds us that even in the grand sweep of history, pyramids, pharaohs, gods, small living things shape the human experience. And sometimes, those living things carry humour if one listens closely. A priest muttering under his breath, a cat smirking from an altar, a leaf drawn just slightly too large in relief, as if winking across millennia. The green threads in sacred art, then, are not just plants. They are whispers, smiles, and legacies, reaching out from the walls of temples and the pages of papyri to tell us. The Egyptians cared, they observed, and they even laughed a little, sometimes at themselves, sometimes at the universe, and sometimes at the humble, resilient plant that quietly threaded its way through life, death, and eternity. We've peeked into the green threads of sacred art. Now let's step inside the ceremonies themselves, where cannabis was not just observed but participated in, quietly enhancing rituals and symbolic acts. Here, among incense smoke and temple shadows, we find evidence that the plant was woven into Egyptian spirituality, part of a subtle dialogue between mortals, gods, and the natural world. Temple reliefs, papyri, and tomb paintings often depict priests and practitioners handling aromatic substances, pouring oils, grinding herbs, or burning resins in elaborate ceremonial contexts. Among these, scholars have identified the likely presence of cannabis sativa, based on textual sources and chemical residue studies. In particular, Kifi incense, a ritual blend of honey, wine, resins, and sometimes cannabis, appears frequently in iconography. Its depiction in hieroglyphs is subtle, a curling wisp of smoke above a censer, or a small leaf tucked into a ceremonial bowl. But for the attentive eye, it is a signature, a hint that cannabis was a participant in sacred rites, quietly influencing mood, perception, and perhaps even the clarity of the priestly mind. Some evidence comes from textual sources paired with archaeological findings. For example, residue analysis of incense burners in Theban temples has revealed cannabinoids, confirming what the art had already suggested. Priests burned these substances at carefully timed moments, sunset, the rising of particular stars, or the recitation of spells, creating a multi-sensory ritual experience. The smoke, mingling with torchlight, was believed to carry prayers to the gods, and perhaps, in the most intimate human sense, to calm the participants themselves. It's easy to imagine a priest leaning over a censer, inhaling faintly, adjusting the mix and thinking, just briefly, "This should calm the pharaoh's soul, and possibly me too." And if we allow ourselves a whimsical stretch, one might picture a minor god rolling their eyes at the improvisation, muttering, "Really, Osiris, did you approve that blend?" Cannabis also appears in symbolic contexts. Leaves or plants are sometimes included in scenes showing healing rituals, offerings, or purification rites. The plant may symbolize divine connection, insight, or rejuvenation, a bridge between the mundane world of human suffering and the transcendent world of the gods. Its presence is rarely central but profoundly meaningful, embedded in layers of artistic and ritualistic narrative. A notable example can be seen in depictions of healing ceremonies. A priest might be shown preparing a poultice or ointment, surrounded by lotus flowers, papyrus, and an unassuming leafy plant, possibly cannabis. The ritual is detailed. The patient reclines. The practitioner recites incantations. Oils are blended and applied, and smoke curls upward from a small censer. It is multisensory, deliberate, and for those who enjoy whimsy, slightly comedic. Perhaps one leaf wobbles in the wind of an open temple door, almost as if it is participating in the spell. Perhaps a small statue of Bastet, perched nearby, tilts its head in quiet judgment. Some researchers suggest that the inclusion of cannabis in ritual iconography reflects its dual role, both practical and symbolic. On a practical level, cannabinoids may have soothed pain, calmed nerves, or induced mild trance states, facilitating participation in ceremonies. Symbolically, the plant represented connection, transition, and divine favour. Its subtle depiction in art reinforced these ideas without overshadowing the broader religious narrative. The Egyptians were masters of layering meaning. A single image could convey health, protection, spiritual clarity, and cosmic order, all through careful arrangement of figures, plants, and symbols. Cannabis, in this sense, was like a whispered footnote from the past, small, understated, yet unmistakably present. The visual message was clear to those who knew. Life, death, and ritual were intertwined, and cannabis was a bridge linking the three. Humour threads through these depictions in unexpected ways. One can imagine a novice scribe, sketching leaves into a temple mural, accidentally enlarging one beyond proportion. The gods, observing, might shake their heads, amused at the audacity of a plant suddenly dominating a sacred scene. And centuries later, a modern scholar squints at the mural, puzzled, muttering, "Is that a lotus? Or did someone just get creative with cannabis?" In some ceremonial depictions, cannabis is paired with other sacred plants such as lotus, myrrh, or coriander. The combined symbolism amplifies its meaning: healing, clarity, divine connection, and perhaps even subtle levity. Smoke rising from an incense burner was not just aromatic, it was a vehicle for intention, carrying prayers, petitions, and occasionally the soft humour of those preparing the rite. Through these depictions, a picture emerges. Cannabis in ancient Egypt was neither trivial nor solely recreational. It was integrated into the fabric of ritual life, used deliberately and recognised symbolically. Its leaves, jars, and smoke appear quietly in art, offering evidence that science and spirituality, observation and imagination, practical knowledge and symbolic power all flowed together seamlessly. And so, as we wander through temples in our mind's eye, the incense curling faintly, the figures frozen in eternal devotion, the faint green of cannabis threads through the scene like a subtle, persistent whisper. It reminds us that rituals were not only acts of piety, but also moments of human insight, humour and creativity, carefully recorded in stone and paint, awaiting those who can appreciate both the fact and the whimsy. Cannabis was, in every sense, a participant in the story, calmly present, quietly potent, occasionally mischievous, and eternally woven into the iconography that defined ancient Egyptian ritual life. Archaeologists and historians often find themselves peering at small details: a carved leaf on a temple wall, a tiny green smudge in a faded papyrus, a subtle curl of smoke in a painted tomb. Each trace offers evidence that cannabis was intentionally included in daily, ceremonial and spiritual life, woven into the fabric of both art and ritual. Scientific studies, from chemical residue analysis in jars and incense burners to microscopic evaluation of embalming materials, confirm what the art has quietly suggested for centuries. It is striking to consider how these traces, both material and visual, connect across time. A priest grinding herbs in Thebes, a scribe drawing delicate leaves on papyrus, a modern scientist pipetting samples into a vial, all participate in their own ways in a continuous dialogue with history. The plant persists, both literally in molecules and figuratively in memory, bridging the gap between human intention and the perception of the divine. Cannabis in Egyptian art often appears alongside other culturally significant symbols, creating layers of meaning. The lotus flower, a symbol of rebirth and purity, the papyrus stalk, emblem of life and knowledge, and cannabis, subtle but significant, together form a visual vocabulary. This vocabulary communicates not just utility, but intention, healing, ritual enhancement, spiritual insight, and perhaps the occasional human chuckle. Imagine a scribe weary from hours of illustrating temple walls, sneaking in a slightly exaggerated leaf, imagining future archaeologists puzzling over its audacity. Yes, he might have thought, they will debate my artistry, and it will amuse them greatly. Modern researchers often find themselves in similarly whimsical situations. One might squint at a faded mural wondering, is that a lotus, a palm, Or did someone centuries ago sneak in a cannabis leaf for fun? Cross-referencing art with texts like the Ebers Papyrus or residue analysis confirms that cannabis was not an accident. But that doesn't diminish the charm of guessing, of imagining the subtle humour of its inclusion. This playful aspect of art underscores a deeper truth. Cultural memory is never entirely serious. The Egyptians approached life, death and spirituality with care, precision and ritual rigour, but they were human, and humour found its way into even the most solemn contexts. Cannabis, in its dual role as practical herb and symbolic emblem, reflects this duality. It could heal, calm and guide, but it could also quietly wink at observers across millennia. The lasting presence of cannabis in art also illuminates the intersection of science and imagination. Modern chemical studies reveal cannabinoids in embalming oils, incense and textiles, aligning with visual and textual evidence. Together they allow us to reconstruct not only the practical applications of the plant, but also its spiritual and cultural significance. A single carved leaf, a tiny painted sprig, or a faint chemical signature becomes a bridge connecting scientific fact with cultural story, grounding whimsy in reality. Even beyond temples and tombs, the symbolic presence of cannabis informs modern understanding of Egyptian ritual and daily life. It reminds us that plants were not inert. They were active participants in human culture, shaping practices, inspiring art, and supporting spiritual and medicinal endeavours. And because these traces survive, modern observers can experience something almost magical, the faint, persistent whisper of a plant that participated in millennia of history. One can imagine standing in a museum, gazing at a jar of residue, a papyrus fragment, or a wall relief. The air is still, shadows of gods, priests and scribes mingle with your imagination, and somewhere, in that quiet, you might hear it, a subtle green whisper, a tiny joke from the past. We were here, we mattered, and yes, we were essential and slightly mischievous. The surreal nature of this conversation across time is part of its charm. Science tells us what is present, art shows us how it was understood, and culture reveals why it mattered. Cannabis threads through all three, a humble leaf connecting life, death, ritual, and memory. Its presence in visual and material culture demonstrates that ancient Egyptians were observers, experimenters, and storytellers, integrating plants into spiritual and practical life with a combination of reverence and human levity. In ancient Egypt, smoke was never just smoke. It was a bridge between worlds, curling upward from burners and censers, carrying prayers, protection, and occasionally the faint aroma of cannabis. While we often imagine rituals in solemn, measured tones, the reality, glimpsed through texts, artifacts, and residue analysis, is that these ceremonies were carefully orchestrated, multisensory experiences blending sight, sound, scent, and intention. Cannabis emerges quietly in this picture. Scientific studies of incense burners and temple residues reveal cannabinoids, confirming what textual sources like the Ebers, papyrus, and Ramesseum papyrus suggest. Cannabis was purposefully incorporated into rituals. Its inclusion may have served multiple roles, calming the mind of priests, facilitating altered states, or enhancing the spiritual atmosphere. In other words, it was a tool for concentration, focus, and perhaps even inspiration. Kaifi incense, one of the most famous ritual blends, often contained honey, wine, resins, myrrh, and, according to some scholars, cannabis. The combination of ingredients produced a complex fragrance that filled temples and ceremonial spaces. As smoke drifted across painted walls, it carried not only the aroma of these substances, but also the intentions and prayers of those performing the rite. modern chemical analysis has detected cannabinoid residues in ancient burners, giving tangible proof that what we see in art and read in texts is matched by material evidence. Imagine a priest kneeling in a temple at dusk. Torches flicker, casting long shadows across stone reliefs. In his hands, a small censer emits tendrils of fragrant smoke. The air is thick with incense, lotus, myrrh, and perhaps a touch of cannabis. He breathes deeply, feeling the calm settle over him. His mind is focused on the words he will speak, the chants that will echo, and the presence of the gods who watch silently. And somewhere in this carefully orchestrated sensory experience, cannabis quietly does its part, soothing nerves, sharpening attention, and subtly elevating awareness. Residue studies reinforce these artistic impressions. In Theban temples, burners and jars have yielded chemical traces consistent with cannabis sativa, suggesting it was deliberately used in ritual rather than being incidental. This aligns with textual accounts of healing rites, protective ceremonies, and funerary practices, where aromatic smoke was an essential component. Cannabis was part of a deliberate, intentional sensory toolkit, enhancing ritual efficacy and perhaps even offering a subtle shift in consciousness. Of course, ceremonial inclusion did not imply recreational excess. Ancient texts emphasize balance and careful preparation, reflecting the Egyptians' understanding of potency. A little goes a long way. A single leaf in a carefully measured mixture could suffice. Humour, of course, is never absent from history. One might imagine a priest sneaking in an extra leaf, glancing nervously at a statue of Bastet or Thoth, and whispering, "It's just a touch. They'll never know." The gods presumably pretend not to notice, amused by the audacity. Cannabis's role in ritual smoke also connects with broader symbolic purposes. Smoke itself was considered a medium through which prayers and intentions could rise to the heavens, an ephemeral conduit linking human and divine. Adding cannabis to the mix was both practical and symbolic. Practical in its medicinal and psychoactive effects, symbolic in its association with insight, clarity, and spiritual facilitation. Together, the combination of scent, visual presence, and botanical properties created a rich, multi-layered ritual experience. Evidence suggests that this practice was not confined to grand temples. Smaller shrines, domestic altars, and funerary rituals could also involve aromatic smoke and cannabis. In these contexts, ritual, protection, and healing intertwined, illustrating the plant's versatility. Its presence reinforced cultural values, attentiveness, reverence, and the belief that humans and gods shared spaces of interaction, mediated by sensory experience. Even from a modern perspective, one can almost hear the subtle humour of these rituals. A priest carefully tending to a censer, incense smoke curling like a mischievous spirit, the occasional leaf wobbling too close to the flame, and the gods watching with quiet amusement. Yet beneath this whimsy lies a foundation of intentional, evidence-backed practice, confirmed by residue analysis, textual references, and archaeological context. Ultimately, cannabis in sacred smoke embodies the intersection of material, symbolic, and spiritual. It was a plant, a tool, and a participant, a green thread woven into the fabric of ritual life. Its lingering presence in residues, texts, and iconography reminds us that the Egyptians approached their spirituality with precision, care, and subtle humour, creating ceremonial spaces that engaged body, mind, and imagination. So when you imagine smoke curling through a temple, carrying prayers, incense, and perhaps a hint of cannabis, picture it as a bridge across time, a faint green whisper connecting ancient ritualists with modern observers, telling us, we crafted this carefully, we sought clarity, calm, and connection, And yes, we occasionally smiled at our own audacity. In the sacred smoke, science, history, and imagination meet, a sensory bridge across millennia. And if you lean in close, listen carefully, and breathe gently, you might just catch the subtle, persistent echo of a plant that participated in humanity's oldest spiritual experiments. If sacred smoke was the stage, then deities were the audience, and sometimes the co-stars. Cannabis, quiet but persistent, threaded its way into the realm of gods and goddesses, a subtle companion to wisdom, protection, and ritual insight. In ancient Egyptian belief, plants were never neutral. They carried intention, power, and, occasionally, a hint of mischief. Cannabis was no exception. The goddess Seshat, patron of writing, measurement, and wisdom, is often depicted with a notched palm or stylus, recording the deeds of mortals and the pharaoh. Scholars suggest that cannabis, sometimes symbolically included near her or within ritual paraphernalia, was associated with mental clarity and insight, assisting scribes, priests, and practitioners in their meticulous work. After all, composing the sacred texts, calculating temple alignments, or recording offerings required a calm, focused mind. And there's evidence that plants like cannabis were used intentionally to facilitate these states. One can imagine a scribe, quill hovering above papyrus, inhaling faint incense and thinking, "A little extra clarity never hurt, even if the cat goddess is silently judging my proportions." Speaking of cats, Bastet, goddess of home, protection, and domestic well-being, may have had her symbolic entourage of plants, including cannabis. Scenes from temples and household shrines show offerings of food, incense, and occasionally herbs that could include cannabis. The plant's presence in these depictions is subtle, tucked into bowls, jars, or ritual arrangements, yet culturally significant, reflecting a bridge between the practical and the divine. A mischievous cat goddess might silently paw at a tiny leaf, her feline gaze both approving and mildly judgmental. Yes, it will protect the household, and maybe improve the mood of your human attendants. Textual sources further support these symbolic associations. While direct references to cannabis in divine contexts are rare, the combination of art, ritual, and pharmacological evidence points to intentional use. Cannabis was incorporated in offerings, temple rituals, and healing practices that intersected with worship. The Ebers Papyrus, for example, details medicinal applications, some of which were likely prepared in conjunction with spiritual intention. Residue analysis of jars and incense burners and temples reveal cannabinoids, confirming that the plant's role extended beyond the purely mundane. Cannabis also appears to have been linked with spiritual perception and altered states. By subtly influencing mood, alertness, or awareness, it could enhance a practitioner's connection to the divine. In ritual texts, incense or ointments containing cannabis were used to create a heightened sensory environment, making prayers, chants, and meditative practices more potent. The gods, depicted in hieroglyphs and reliefs, were often shown observing or interacting with these acts, silently acknowledging the careful use of sacred plants. Humour, of course, threads through these divine connections. One can picture a young priest nervously preparing an offering of cannabis-infused incense, glancing up at a stone-carved bastet and whispering, "I swear I measured it perfectly." The goddess, in her eternal cat-like serenity, tilts her head, tail flicking, silently conveying, "Perhaps, or perhaps not. Either way, proceed with dignity." Even Seshat, watching over meticulous scribes, might raise an eyebrow at a slightly oversized leaf tucked into the mix. The gods, we like to imagine, had a wry appreciation for human creativity and occasional folly. Artistic depictions reinforce these associations. Cannabis leaves appear near deities in funerary scenes, healing rituals and temple offerings, suggesting that the plant was a medium of divine connection rather than a casual accessory. Its symbolic weight is subtle but significant. Clarity, protection, insight, and spiritual facilitation all resonate through these small visual cues. Cannabis functioned as a green ambassador, quietly bridging the worlds of mortals and immortals. In practice, this meant that priests, healers, and worshippers treated cannabis with reverence and intention. It was not recreational in the modern sense, but it was deeply integrated into sacred spaces, used deliberately to enhance ceremony, prayer, and meditation. The plant's effects were recognized, respected, and incorporated thoughtfully, a tangible reminder of the Egyptians' sophisticated understanding of both nature and ritual. Even beyond temples, the symbolic association persisted. Household altars, healing shrines, and funerary preparations all included plants with spiritual connotations, cannabis among them. It was ordinary and extraordinary, practical yet symbolic, mundane yet magical, the perfect companion for divine affairs. Ultimately, the connection between cannabis and deities reminds us that plants were participants in spiritual life, not mere tools. They were active, meaningful, and sometimes mischievously playful. The subtle, symbolic presence of cannabis in relation to Sechat, Bastet, and other deities offers a glimpse into how Egyptians integrated observation, ritual, and imagination, creating a culture where even a single leaf could carry profound significance. And so, when we imagine the temple at dusk, incense curling, priests chanting, deities watching, we can also imagine the green thread of cannabis weaving through it all, offering calm, insight, protection, and perhaps a quiet smile from a cat goddess who had seen it all before. It is practical, symbolic, and endlessly whimsical, a reminder that the sacred and the human were deeply intertwined, and that the smallest elements of life could touch the divine. Good night,